Bridging different identities is perhaps in my blood. As the daughter of a Turkish father and an American mother, I grew up in a household where Christmas and Eid were equally festive and important. Being a city kid, I never imagined working in agricultural development, at least not until I read about Norman Borlaug, who lived and breathed his mission. Some of his last words were, "Take it to the farmer." Now consider this. What if our collective mental imagery of the farmer and our imagination of what his, her, or their life should look like is shaping the development agenda? And what if we're perpetuating gender inequality? Are we taking it to all the farmers? Gender determines what a farmer has the right to access: land, labor, inputs, information, credit, technology, markets, machinery, and much, much more. Women and girls face systematic barriers to owning and managing farms, yet they tend to fields planted with varieties they had no control over the development of. Homes, villages, marketplaces are not controlled environments. Every decision, every action that occurs in people's lives happens in a social context. Gender is an inescapable part of this. Hearing similar statements repeatedly is what sparked my own transformation and made me question, how could we completely insulate important life decisions from farmers' lives? We may continue producing varieties that won't get adopted or miss poverty alleviation goals if genetic gains do not translate to equity gains for women and girls. And as much as gender influences the lives of farmers, it influences our lives. If in our own institutions and programs we continue to create barriers for women, how can we expect to remove barriers for women smallholder farmers? Dr. Borlaug's message to take it to the farmer was a wake-up call. But it's increasingly clear that to really fulfill his vision, we need to listen to unheard voices. Women do have voices. To hear them, we have to build bridges between crop improvement and social sciences, between the lab bench and the village bench. We also need to look inside ourselves, to question our assumptions, and to identify our internalized norms around gender, which we project onto our work and the populations we serve.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series on April 23rd.
Welcome to the Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science seminar series. There is interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Hindi. To access the interpretation, you choose the language of your preference by clicking the translation button at the base of your Zoom screen. This seminar will be recorded and made available on the CIMIT YouTube channel. We invite you to follow us in LinkedIn, YouTube, and social media using the hashtag Women in Science for the Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science seminar series. On the screen, you can see the QR code that will give you access to Slido for submitting questions and comments to be addressed in the Q&A session. We will be hearing today from a pioneering agricultural scientist and gender researcher, Dr. Hale Ann Tufan, leader of the Equitable Agricultural Research Lab at Cornell. Right after her presentation, Dr. Hale Ann Tufan will have a conversation with Dr. Naela Qureshi, who is a wheat rust pathologist and molecular geneticist at CIMIT. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Bran Goberts, Director General of CIMIT, to officially open the event and welcome our distinguished speaker of today, Dr. Hale Ann Tufan. Dr. Goberts, over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending from where you are tuning in. And once again, welcome to our Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science webinar. At CIMIT, we launched a TED Talk meets Fireside Chat style series on women leaders now more than a year and a half ago, because we wanted more women leaders in science institutions like ourselves to be heard, to be shown, as you can't be what you can see. To achieve this goal of a broader representation and gender balance in science, we need to provide more opportunities to hear from women leaders, their life journey, their lessons, their insights. And not only do we listen and highlight leadership styles from outside our organization, I'm very thrilled that every catalyst of change we can show a hero of our own, a very true catalyst within CIMIT, interviewing these fantastic women as a leader within CIMIT, as she shows how she leads by example, she listens, and therefore steers forward our mission. So also today, we have a leader from within CIMMYT, wheat scientist this time, to interview a true catalyst of change, Hale Ann Tufan. She's our already 18th catalyst of change speaker. Hale Ann Tufan leads the Equitable Agricultural Research Lab at Cornell University, which brings together researchers with experience in plant breeding, agricultural economics, geographic information systems, anthropology, gender studies, science, and technology. And this to contribute to equitable crop improvement theory and practice. Hale explores how agricultural research processes and outputs can positively contribute to gender equality and social inclusion. Through her research to develop methods and approaches, she enables gender analysis in agricultural innovation while advocating for inclusive agricultural research by challenging power and norms in the research ecosystem itself. Hale serves in the leadership positions of several grant-funded projects, including priority-setting co-lead of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement, principal and investigator of the gender-responsive research equipped for agricultural transformation, or more easy, the CREATE project, and principal investigator of the Muhogo Bora Better Cassava for All project. Hale brings a multidisciplinary background to her research, spanning PhD-level research in molecular plant pathogen interactions, plant breeding with CIMMYT, International Agricultural Research for Development Program Management, and gender research and capacity development across sub-Saharan Africa. She is also the 2019 recipient of the Norman Borlaug Field Award, endowed by the Rockefeller Foundation and awarded by the World Food Programme. I am sure that all of you are equally thrilled as I am to listen to her experiences and to learn a lot from Hale's outstanding leadership experience. Therefore, without further introduction, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker and hand it now over to her. Once again, welcome, Hale. Over to you.
Thank you, Bram, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to kind of come home to CIMMYT, so I'm going to just share my laptop, my screen for just a minute. Okay, can I just get confirmation? Everyone can see my screen. Good, thank you. All right, thank you, Bram, for the invite. And I mean, I've loved these series. I love that CIMMYT is hosting them. So congratulations for putting this together, and thank you for including me. It's nice to talk to you today. This is a topic very close to my heart, something I think about every day. So I was asked to give kind of a 20-minute presentation on my career journey. I'm going to take liberty with that a little bit, mostly because talking about yourself for 20 minutes is not my favorite thing to do, but I really want to talk about how do we enable catalysts of change. So we're focusing on women who kind of make it through the system. What does it look like to make it so more women make it through the system? So it's not an exception, but really the rule. So I'll be taking some time to talk about the work that we do, not our research, but broader research that points in this direction. So thank you for bearing with me through that. So Bram introduced me a little bit. I'm going to talk about my career journey and what that looked like, a little bit about myself. You know, we're all scientists, but I'll talk a little bit about this, but we're also people. And so I was born and raised in Turkey. I have 2 kids. I identify as a feminist, and I love the work that I do. So everything that I'm talking about comes from a place of who I am and how I see the world and how I've navigated my career with all that in mind. So we all see kind of where I'm sitting right now, which is as a faculty member at Cornell, but what did that look like from a career trajectory? I started really as an undergrad at Colorado State. I did a biochemistry undergraduate degree. I wanted to be a vet. I loved animals. So I started kind of on a more animal-focused trajectory when I realized I could not dissect animals or do any lab work on them. I shifted to plants. I had less of a problem kind of doing lab work on plants than I did on animals. So that was my beginning of the plant science journey in my undergraduate degree to kind of gain research experience and additional funding. I worked in a lab throughout my whole undergraduate degree in a plant science lab. And then when I graduated, I thought, oh, I want to go back home to Turkey. So I went to Boğaziçi University in Istanbul to do my master's. And this is where kind of agricultural research started. This was a lab working on wheat, durum wheat specifically, and leaf rust resistance. So I did research there in my master's. It was great. I got introduced to a whole new set of skills. And then I got kind of hooked on plant science, molecular plant pathogen interactions specifically. After that, I went to the John Innes Center, mostly because of an existing relationship between the PIs of these two institutions that was kind of made it easier for me to transition. And I really, spent 4 or 5 years there doing molecular plant pathogen interactions, looking specifically on non-host resistance in wheat. So that was really fun. And near the end, I realized I'm not meant to be in the lab. I really had a moment of realization where I wanted to get out of the lab, see the real world, do work that I could see affecting change. And that's where I met CIMMYT in its broader sense in the International Winter Wheat Improvement Program in Turkey, again, going back home. And I spent kind of half of my time over the next 2 years after my PhD shuttling between UEA, School of International Development, looking at more critical looks at development at the same time spending a lot of the field season at CIMMYT, the Winter Wheat Improvement Program, CIMMYT, Turkish National Program in Jakarta. So that was, I would say, kind of a pivot in my career where I realized applied research was really interesting. How do I get more into agricultural development focused research? I went to the Natural Resources Institute back in the UK for a postdoc working on sweet potato and cassava, which kind of shifted my crop interests more towards sub-Saharan Africa and food security crops. And then I spent the next 10 years before becoming a faculty member here, really working in an applied ag research on the Next Gen Cassava project, great projects, other projects, really looking at being out in the field and doing more practitioner-oriented work on international ag research. So that all looks really kind of clean and linear and like I had an intention through the whole journey, starting from undergraduate to becoming a faculty member. But I would say a more honest version of that career trajectory is very messy, right? I think often we don't talk about how messy career trajectories can be and how much of it is chance, how much of it is making some wrong decisions just to find the right decision around the corner. So it wasn't like I knew I never intended to be a faculty member, but really bouncing back and forth, trying applied research, going back to more basic research at John Innes, going, oh no, I really want to be out in the field, going back really into the field, then going back to a different version. So I think one thing to take home from career journeys is they're really never linear, right? So we shouldn't expect them to be linear. We shouldn't put pressure on ourselves to have one way of going in one direction, that all paths are their own path, and that's okay. And they end up being the best for what you need and what you want. So ending up in the space on the right, which is kind of symbolized by this Cornell logo, is also a little bit of a career transition. So what you don't really see there is I'm going more from basic molecular biology to really working on social science oriented with social scientists, research questions around gender and ag, right? So often when I give talks, the biggest question people ask is, how does a molecular biologist end up working on gender equality, right? This is not the most logical career progression either. And when I get asked that question over the years, it's got me thinking on what that moment of transition really looked like. And when I do look back, I really do come back to my experience with CIMMYT, being out in the field, being a young woman researcher, working really intensively with not really with women who were farmers. That was really the research side of things. I was more on the research stations. But anytime we interacted or we had field days where we were interacting with women farmers, I found myself much more interested in their life journeys and their experiences and their desires and needs than I really was interested in producing the seeds, right? So it was this moment where I realized this is so much more interesting. How do I shift into really making this central point? So the marriage between the work that you do and your personal passion, which for me was really women's rights, those two collided. How can I make agriculture research more fair, both for women scientists, but also serving women farmers more equitably? So at this point, at this kind of right-hand side, I don't think arrive is the right word, but the current status that I'm living in is leading the Equal Lab. I think Bram described it a little bit, so I won't repeat it, but just to say all of our research serves this goal, right? How do we have gender equality and social inclusion, specifically around crop improvement, but also seed systems and more broadly agricultural research? One thing I'll point out at the bottom is we really employ, I'll talk about this a little bit more, a feminist research praxis. So how do we actually approach the process of research from a more equitable and feminist lens? We also do a lot of interdisciplinary methodology and collaborative research. So I can talk for all day about the research we do, and I won't really delve in on it. This is a snapshot of what we do, but this top angle here is where this talk really touches on the work that we do in the lab, and that's really more analysis of research systems. So being a woman leader in agriculture, what does that mean? How is that experienced, right? What are the different experiences of women? How does management and leadership play out? What is the research culture? How are the relationships playing out? What are the care responsibilities of faculty? So we do kind of a lot of research on that top end, which I won't talk about our research, but I'm going to take a moment to take liberty again of being someone who thinks about research a lot, to touch back, because if we want to enable catalysts of change, I think we need to be very realistic about what people are experiencing, right? So I'm going to call this section things we probably know, but we still need to talk about. You may be familiar with this graph. It's called the leaky pipeline. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It really shows you how women across career phases and trajectories end up, quote unquote, dropping out of STEM-based careers, so science-based careers, right? They choose alternate careers. And usually this is a sharp decline after the undergraduate. It becomes sharper. So there's many, many, many papers written on this phenomena in Europe and in the US. I'm just putting this here to remind us that catalysts of change are really existing in these broader social systems, right? That this is a big snapshot of what happens to women in science more broadly. And that's because when we think of women in science, we're not talking about scientists as objective beings that exist outside of social systems, right? Being a scientist is not a state that's different from being a human existing in your own life. Sometimes we can mix those things up. We think as scientists, we're completely objective and we can forget who we are in our life experience and be objective scientists, but scientists can be very different. Being a scientist is one of many social identities, right? We can be scientists and be Turkish. We can be scientists and be women. They're queer scientists, women scientists, Black scientists, all experiencing very different life journeys and what it means to be a scientist in their own paths, right? So I think that's really important to remember, that we're all treading these multiple identities at the same time while centering on our identity of being a scientist. So in summary, I like to think about this as saying we're not born scientists. We really don't come into the world as objective researchers, right? We've grown up in social structures. We are immersed in families and states, productive structures, and how we view the world and how the world views us is really molded by that. And that comes with all sorts of problems as well as advantages, right? You may have heard a couple words of jargon here: implicit bias. That means refers to the prejudice and stereotypes that individuals hold at an unconscious level. So I could be thinking something about someone else based on a deeply held prejudice or a stereotype. So I already think I know what they're going to do and who they are and what they're like. And those can be very negative, especially for women in science. And this can manifest in different ways. This is a great book if you're into this kind of thing, Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi, and he unpacks what's called stereotype threat. And they did these early social psychology experiments with women in science, for example, where they took two groups of young women, and to one group, before a math test, they told them, you know, women are bad at math, right? And to the other group, they didn't say anything. And what they saw that is consistently over multiple times of doing this, the group that was told women are bad at math, these are women taking the math test, actually underperform. And then they go into a lot of years and years and decades of research to unpack why. And they call this stereotype threat, because what they see is if you really care about being a mathematician and you're told that women are bad at math, you don't want to be another woman who's bad at math. So that stereotype of being bad at math actually paralyzes you. So you go into that test fearing that you're not going to do well. So it's really interesting. These are deeply held psychological processes that as women in science and trying to become catalysts of change, we're not even aware of these things happening in the background. And this is felt again differently for different women. Women are not one homogenous group, right? We have all come from different places. We have different religions, ethnicities, race, ages, ability status, sexual orientation, income. So Kimberly Crenshaw, she defined what's called intersectionality, which means different identities coming together. She defined it as in the legal sense, saying women in the eyes of the US legal system were being discriminated. Black people were being discriminated against, but being a Black woman, you have double discrimination, right? So you're being discriminated against in two different axes. So this we see a lot in science as well. For example, these are numbers from the US, and I'm not going to go deeply, but give you a broad snapshot. What this is showing you is basically, if you're an Asian woman in science, this is the second column on the top figure, you feel like you're expected to be a good mother and being a child, having fewer hours of work so you can take care of children. And that's felt differently if you're Black, Latina, or white. So this plays out very differently, right? Again, Asian women are feeling more pressured to have more feminine roles. Most women are feeling like they're being discriminated against, but they have support structures. And probably most devastatingly, almost half of Black and Latina scientists in the US have been mistaken for either being administrative or custodial staff. Again, what does it mean to be a woman in these systems where you're having these experiences? How does that play out? The bottom one here is about marital status, for example, just to illustrate that these things play out differently. If you're a married father, your career progression is kind of unchanged as you go forward. Single women and married mothers have very different career trajectories and often, quote unquote, drop out of the research earlier on. So that leaky pipeline is experienced differently. So I'm talking about a lot of broad phenomena, but I also wanted to make the point that we're not saying all of this from a point of, anecdotal evidence. There's a lot of research out there, and I just wanted to provide a snapshot from very high level. We're all scientists. We respect institutions like Science, Nature, PNAS. There's been so many articles over the last, decades really demonstrating the experiences of women in science. So I'm going to take a few things saying, to enable catalysts of change and to enable women, there's so many different intervention points. For example, hiring. There was this paper in PNAS, and there's many others, for example. This is at the very, very early career stage, US faculty hiring students, right? And they're showing in controlled experiments where they have identical profiles, and one is a kind of a stereotypically women's name, one is a stereotypical man's name. They're seeing that faculty are less likely to hire young women. And if they do, they don't give them as much support, and they judge them to be less competent, right? This is at the earliest career stage as a student, as you're trying to get into science. Other research shows that getting grants as a young faculty is, much more discriminatory against African-American and Black scientists. And you see this across. This is NIH awards, which are some of the most prestigious awards in the US for science. And you're seeing at the East step, if you're African-American Black scientist, you're getting less favorably rated across all the steps. And when they look at the explanatory factors, they see that this is because these scientists are doing more community-oriented or collaborative research, and that's ending up penalizing them in the end. There's been a lot of attention over the last 3-4 years. I think this is really relevant for CIMMYT as well, what it means to have fieldwork safety. There's been a lot of discussions around that I've been hearing. How do you go out into the field and collect data? And as a young woman who has done this, and I'm sure many of you have as well, there's a sense of how do we assure teamwork safety in the field, right? If you're a young Black woman going out in the field in an area where you may be the only Black scientist, what does that feel like? This was an article written for Nature by some students at Cornell looking at fieldwork safety. What does it mean to be a queer scientist, a scientist with disabilities, right? What does it mean to be a woman scientist working out in the field? These are really important things that we need to think very carefully about, and that affect the ability of women to become and stay in the workforce. This is a great piece, again, just to show you how systematic this bias is. This was looking at 300,000 papers in plant science last year. It's a really new paper. where they look at men and women who's publishing what in plant science specifically. So on the bottom left here, you see NNM is men, NNF is women, basically. They're seeing that women are publishing significantly less than men. But what's interesting thing is that the impact factor is almost equal. So even though women are publishing less, they're publishing at the same impact factor. But on the right-hand kind of the bar chart here, they're cited less. So there's so much systematic inequality in who's publishing in plant sciences and who's being cited. Again, a lot of figures here. Ignore the figures. I'm just showing you there's so much great research out there. This is this has become a really interesting concept I'm hearing people talk more about, the diversity innovation paradox. What that means is people who are innovative, so make connections between concepts that have never been connected before, are publishing really impactful papers, are more often people from minoritized identities. That's really interesting. They're either non-white or women. But what's interesting thing is, even though women and people who are non-white are more innovative in their research, they're significantly cited less. So they call this the paradox. So even though people who are more diverse are more innovative, they're also valued less. So this again is to say, if you're a woman in science and you're out there doing your thing, publishing, being innovative, it's not that the shortcoming is with you. It's that the system is really biased towards receiving some of that research and seeing women in science in a different way. This was a really interesting piece looking at communication. How are women perceived in communicating their work, right? And these are some keywords in a word cloud that you'll see, women are seeing as being emotional, bossy, apologetic. These are mostly negative traits, right? That women are seen as being in a certain way, even when communicating their research. So wrapping this up here in a mini lecture, what I want us to walk away with is thinking, not why are they so few catalysts of change and women leaders in agriculture that we're kind of working in. They're real life reasons and really discriminatory structures and barriers that have been put in women's path for the why so few question, right? We saw, for example, your social identity, who you are, who you're perceived to be, and how valued you feel really shapes your experience, right? If you don't feel like you belong, if you feel like you're being stereotyped, oh, she can't do that work, she's just a woman. You feel like you're being excluded or the only one in the room. That really affects you negatively in terms of how you can function, right? There's real research showing this, that the cognitive operations necessary to solve scientific complex problems are real life experienced and negatively impacted by those feelings of being not belonging, excluded, being stereotype threat. So what they see over and over again is what I'm trying to say here is really there's the system that really is holding a lot of women back, right? It's not women's own performance problems necessarily. So I was kind of invited here not to give a lecture, but give personal reflection. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit at the very end here in the last moments. And just share things that, I try to remember when I'm navigating my professional path based on everything I just showed around the research, right? How does this change the way I act? So a lot of times I try to remember it's not about me. It's not about my ego. There can be very tough conversations where people see you in a certain way, say certain things, and I have to park that and say, it's not about me. It's about the greater good, right? That I can't come from a point of woundedness and have a generative conversation. A lot of times people talk about imposter syndrome, feeling like you don't belong, you don't know what you're talking about. Everyone feels this. I feel it a lot. And I find the best way to go about it is being honest with what you don't know. I try not to pretend I know something. I always say, I don't know. Can you tell me more about that? Because that helps you really be more honest and learn more. And I would say, this has been showed over and over again with research, having mentors, having champions and sponsors is so important. So if you don't have someone who's sponsoring you, being your champion, that is so important because they will open doors for you always. And the last few things, maybe the don'ts is, like I said, my career path is so unusual and so messy in a way. Over the years, I've learned, I don't want to define what success looks like. I want to define it myself. Other people have very different ways to look at what success and career trajectories look like. especially if you do interdisciplinary work, often you can't be defined. One of my favorite games is listening to how people introduce you. Is she a breeder? Is she a gender researcher? So it's okay. You don't need to wear kind of labels and stick to that. And because I have 2 kids, I have a lot of guilt around work-life balance and all of that, but not succumbing to that guilt is really important. And in our lab, we do practice a lot of feminist leadership. Myself, as a leader now, I really embrace a lot of these values of being a feminist leader and what that means. Again, I won't go in depth here, but how that plays out for us is thinking about how many other people have I enabled? Have we enabled as a group? Is everyone on the team content? Have they choose their own path? Is there no judgment or pressure? Are we dismantling those systems of power and redistributing power? And are we making a difference? So the bottom line in closing, what does this all mean? I just want us to walk away with realizing that a lot of the time, giving more training to women, having women change the way they act, lean in, do this, do that, is often not the problem. The problem is the power and the politics of the systems, the discriminatory systems that women are walking a fine line in. So I really think we need to take long, hard looks at our own institutions and what we're doing. And this is at Cornell too. I push people a lot of time to think about these things and really not expect women to change, but really focus on the system. So I really like this piece, for example, looking at, as I get mad and emotional sometimes and I want to make change, I come back to this point is my anger doesn't serve me, but working with that anger to make change is really important. So I found this really inspiring, and I just kind of included a quote here from this paper with Allison and a co-author, that really people of all genders and all career stages should be working together to fight the misogyny status quo. Surviving as a woman in science shouldn't be a perilous and exhausting high wire balancing act. We'll all be more powerful and effective when female leaders are supported to be equitable participants in the diverse and holistic scientific organizations of the future. So thank you for bearing with me through that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Hale. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We'll have the questions from the audience as well, but we do have some specific questions. So my name is Naila Qureshi, and I'm working in the Global Wheat Program as a wheat rust pathologist and molecular geneticist. So I'm sure all of us here are very excited to have a chance to learn about your experiences, your perspectives and insights on not only being a scientist, but also as you're playing very important role in exploring how various innovative agricultural processes and their outputs can positively contribute to gender equality and social inclusion. Thank you for being the inspiration and for all the work that you've been doing. So I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. You did touch base most of those questions, but still I would like to go one by one, and maybe if you can touch base a little bit more on that. So with this, I would like to start by asking you that you developed different interests within the scientific disciplines during your career. So did you have inspirations who served as turning points in your decision to pursue and then advance in your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the base motivation to focus on gender in agriculture really came from that experience and curiosity about women farmers. That I realized was much more important to me than the science. I love working with scientists. I love science, but I realized my role was not in generating the data and being kind of the person in the field, but really looking at the bigger level picture of how are women scientists and farmers in the system. So I guess I can say that captured my heart and my passion so much, I couldn't ignore it. At some point, I just had to make that transition. It really wasn't easy. It took years. It took a lot of hard work. It took a lot of taking jobs I wasn't happy with, but I knew the end game was what I wanted to do. So inspiration was seeing people who had done that before. There are a number of what we call crossover researchers going from more basic kind of biophysical scientists to social sciences. Some of my inspirations, like Jemima Njuki, who's at UN Women right now, started as a livestock scientist and then is now in one of the highest institutions, right, in gender research. So seeing that it could be done gave me hope. It made it a little bit easier to think, okay, I can get there. I see people doing it. So yeah, that's what this series is about, having examples of people who have done it. And if it's not there, that knowing that you can be the first example, and that's okay too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's really important to have those inspirations, that having someone to look up to, and then, as you said, that you can be your own example as well. So yeah. My next question is that we do talk about, that women in science do face problems. But then, in your opinion, what do you think that can be done to remove those barriers that, women in science face?
Yeah. That's why I wanted to reflect on those big research pieces. I mean, what I would like to say is there is so much information out there. It's not for a lack of knowledge. What I think is it's a lack of action, right? I don't think we know the solutions. There are so many guides, so many good practices, so many positive examples. What I observe is institutional lock-in, where institutions are not willing to make big changes. You really have to make big changes, right? These are not just, let's add more women into the mix. In fact, the research shows if you bring women into unwelcoming environments, they just drop out, right? So it's not about recruiting, it's about retention, and it's about the system, it's about the institution being a welcoming place. So those are really hard changes. And most of the time, I don't see the willingness to really make those changes. I mean, in agriculture, it's particularly unique as well, because we do a lot of different kind of work. I think the research itself is quite, I would like to say, masculine. We published a piece on this last year, looking at how we can look at that concept of masculinity within ag research, right? So I don't want to give specific examples because I think there's so much out there. There is really a ton of research and a ton of best practice. So I want to call for change, right? To be bold and just make those changes. It's not for a lack of answers, I guess. Yeah.
True. Yeah, that's right. I think my next question is something that I often think about as well. And then, when we talk about women in science, it's not only women, but then it has like equal contribution from other side as well. So do you think that, in your opinion, is it better to create leadership initiatives for both men and women to actually help raise awareness of the issue, rather than only focusing on, women, but having like both sides and raising that awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's take a step back. If you look at research on gender in agriculture, focusing on farmers, for example, there's been a huge shift towards what's called gender transformative research, or focusing on masculinities in gender and agriculture, because what you realize over time is only focus on women, which is 40, 50 years ago was what was happening in gender and development, didn't work. It backfired. A lot of the time, just giving women resources actually ended up putting them in worse positions, right? So now at the farm level, at least, good practices is more about how do you change the social norms? How do you change the community and not just empower one woman, but you kind of change so that future generations of women are also benefiting, right? So it's like once you have a mindset change or a normative change, that keeps going, right? That's kind of what the development practice is going towards. Now, whether we're doing the same in research, I don't know, right? So I think maybe as we're thinking of leadership, training men and women, of course, for good leadership skills, but within that, we should be training them for inclusive leadership. We shouldn't be training them in one leadership style, which is very based on historically defined what it means to be a good leader. It doesn't mean you go in and you bang tables and you make noise and the most powerful voice in the room wins. Well, if that's our norm, we can train women to be louder, and maybe some women are louder than others, but it's creating inequality. That's what the research says too, right? Leadership styles, management styles also are very gendered. So how do we understand leadership and management differently? How do we play that out differently? So yes, for training for everyone, but yes, also to re-examine what we conceive as being a good leader, what we conceive as being a good manager as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very true, because often our definition of being a leader is like, it varies from
Yes.
person to person. So trying to understand that what exactly does it mean, and then, taking it forward so that it can benefit everyone, not just one
Yeah.
side.
And also realizing when we're saying that person is not a good leader, that we're not making a judgment based on our own
Mhm.
conceptualization. They may be a great leader if you ask their
Yeah,
team and so there's also
exactly.
that perception and bias piece too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question is like, people often talk about having this work-life balance. So, how do you balance career, your personal life, and your passion? Do you think that there is really a thing as balance, and then you could just like, keep everything at a balanced level and then move forward?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think I haven't solved it. I still struggle with it all the time, but one thing I have let go of is when I catch myself feeling guilty. I catch
Mhm.
that feeling and I say, okay, no, because that's a very destructive feeling. Feeling guilt is very destructive. It doesn't help anyone. And it's both ways. I feel guilty when I'm with my kids and I think I didn't finish this piece of work. I'm guilty at work when I think, oh, I should be spending time with my kids. Right. So that doesn't help if I'm guilty all the time. So what I try to do is catch it and tell myself, a friend of mine told me this, and this may be useful advice. I was feeling guilty about traveling a lot. And I said, oh, why am I doing this? I'm away from my kids a lot. And she said, as they grow up, they're going to see someone who loves what they do and they're going to be proud of you. So as the older they get, they're going to say, yeah, my mom did this and that. And she was this, so hanging on to that, what you symbolized for your children is not always being present, but also showing them what's possible in the world, showing them you're doing something that you love, and that's a part of who you are. So I've tried to find ways of balancing those. And another thing I'll say is I don't feel bad about leaving early. I go pick my kids up. What we do in our lab is there's no work hours. You do your work when you do your work, especially as a parent. You just have to do that because if I were to stay here at blocks of time, I wouldn't be able to do anything. So my philosophy is, as long as you get the work done, I don't really care when you do it. You can do it anytime you want, anywhere you want. It's just up to you. Everyone is different, right? So creating that flexibility really helps, I think. And the last thing I'll say is kind of, you can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself. So I also try to model saying, I need a day off, everyone. I'm too tired. I'm not functioning well. And I don't do that in a covert way. I actually say that to say, I'm taking a day off to be with my kids. I'm taking a day off to take care of myself. You do it too. Take your birthday off, take the Monday off, whatever. So that's what research shows again, is people that care for themselves can care for others more effectively. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very true that, like, I think a lot of women, and I would say that men as well, can relate that, feeling guilty of, that maybe like one side or the other, it can never be like, you can't be satisfied with whatever one or the other thing you're doing. So I think it's great, like, but the inner satisfaction comes from your own, that, what you're doing is, and having that flexibility to kind of like, say that, okay, this is where I stop, and then do something else,
Yep,
and then we'll get back to it. So
exactly.
yeah, I think
Learning
that's
to
great.
say no. The
Yeah,
hardest thing is learning to say no.
exactly. Yeah, it's not easy to do that, but yes. You In your last slides, you did mention about the imposter syndrome. So I wanted to kind of like touch base that as well, that like, if you have ever felt it, you did say that you do, and then like, and you did say that how do you navigate way through
Uh-huh.
it as well. So what I wanted to ask was like, also that if you've never felt it, maybe, or if you don't feel it as much as some other people do, what would you say to them, that how to get over it? It's not as easy, it's easy to say than rather doing it. But then, like, in your opinion, you did touch base a little bit that how do you manage it, but then for other people that who do go through it?
Again, there's a lot of research on this. So women and people with minoritized identities in the US, this is people of color, people of disabilities, working in ag systems, queer individuals, tend to self-select and self-mute, right? Because we're taught over years and years that we shouldn't be here, we don't belong, we're not as good as people say. So
Yeah.
there is an imbalance on who feels that. We know that the research shows us that. what I've learned over the last probably recent 4 or 5 years is that talking to people who from the outside look like they have everything down, they're national academies, they've got amazing reputations, having frank conversations with them and hearing them say, I don't know. I also felt like this was just eye-opening because you realize, and that's what I was trying to say, everyone feels that sometimes. And if you don't feel it, I think it's more of a problem if you're not questioning your own ability to tackle things, because overconfidence and thinking you have the answers to everything can be as destructive as being paralyzed by imposter syndrome, right? So it's a really fine balancing act. Earlier in my career, it would have been harder to be honest with not knowing because you feel like people will discount you. They'll think, oh, she doesn't belong here. So I was much more quiet with what I didn't know. I tried to go along and learn things. But now I have the power to be able to say, I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about. Teach me this has been liberating. So whether we can expect everyone to do that, I don't know. But as a coping mechanism in your head, remember, even if someone comes across as being a walking, talking god of science, deep down, they have insecurities, they have doubt, they have things they don't know. That's a facade. So you have to see beyond that and remind yourself, this is all an act. A lot of people act, right? That's where we're social beings. We go into these relationships acting out certain roles and characters. So don't let it shut you down, right? You have value, you have knowledge, you have something to contribute. Let them do their thing. And in your time and in your way, you contribute, right? So it's one of the hardest things is the imposter syndrome, but it gets better. It doesn't go away, but you get better at catching it and pushing it away. It's a conscious, when I find it coming, I go, nope, you're going away. I'm not listening to you, right? So it's kind of
making that conscious effort to, kind of like let it go. So
Mhm.
I think we're running short of time. So I think I'm kind of like close this by just asking you the last question, that what advice would you give to all of the female colleagues that we have here, and also maybe people who will be listening later, to the next generation of women in science?
Yeah. The most healing thing I have had or discovered is finding a support group. So it may seem simple, but at the end of the day, if I've had a bad day, just this week, I had a microaggression where someone said something I couldn't believe to me. And I immediately texted my support group of friends, people who understood me in a similar career level. They can be all over the world. They don't have to be next door. But having that SOS line of saying, you won't believe what this person just said to me. And then there's this, and that's where I think like the feminist principles work. We all care for each other. We put everything down and say, okay, this, so think about this and don't worry about that. And really the healing and the kind of getting away from those bad feelings that you experience, I go back to my support structure. So finding your support structure, because no one can do it alone. No one ever does it alone. If you ask for people who, climb the ladder that you think are most successful, they'll point to mentors, they'll point to supporters, they'll point to people who have caught them along the way and help them get back up. So if you don't have that, first order of business, be honest with each other too. We're brutally honest with each other where we're like, oh, I've had the worst day, or maybe you should think of that. And it helps. It really helps everyone get through the day. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hale. It was a great advice for all of us, and it was really lovely talking to you. I'm going to hand it over to Isabel. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naela, for having this very enlightening conversation with Dr. Tufan. Now we would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We invite you to raise your hand, to turn on your camera, and unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question or comment, or you can submit it via Slido. We have already several questions, and we have received one in the Q&A box that we have in the Zoom. So it says, great talk and insights. Thank you for sharing. Indra Nui, former CEO of PepsiCo, mentioned in one of her talks, mentors pick you, you don't pick them. They pick you because they see something in you that they want to hitch their wagon to. Why do you think there's still a common belief that the opposite is true, particularly when applied to mentorship programs? Thank you again.
Yeah, that's a great question. Mentors that I've had great experiences with, it's gone both ways. So I don't think one or the other is true. Sometimes I have picked mentors where I've approached people and asked them to talk to me or get advice from. And at other times, I've noticed people pay attention, they're interested in your career, they come talk to you, and then they kind of pick you, right? Whether they're picking you for a reason, I don't know. Maybe they see something in you. Maybe I often find, especially for women mentors, they see themselves in you and they want to pass forward. They want to give back and say, I want to mentor someone else at this, later stage of your career. So I think mentoring programs are good, but it is like matchmaking, right? Not all mentoring, you can't just take two people and put them together and expect that to work. I think there's an element of compatibility, joint interest, understanding. Um, so I'm not clear with all the available mentoring programs. Mentoring is critical. I know that for sure. How they get set up, I think also needs to be thought carefully, that we're not assuming any mentor is a mentor, right? There's different types of mentoring. In fact, at Cornell now, they're calling like, even for a student, you don't assume there's one mentor. We call it like group mentoring. I can be a mentor to a student in one way, but I encourage them to go find 3, 4 other mentors who mentor them in other ways, right? One person may be topically a better mentor. One person may be a mentor for their life experience. I can't assume I can take care of every aspect of a student's mentoring needs. So I would encourage not one mentor, but multiple, and each mentor will give you something different. But at the end of the day, you take that and you make your own decisions. So I guess I don't know if I answered the question, but what I would say is definitely not one mentor, but a group of mentors that help you in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. Here in the slide, we have several questions that we have received. It says, how can we implement systematic changes to encourage greater participation of women scientists in the field?
In the field. Oh, that's such a great question. Okay, I'm going to start with my academic hat on, and I'm going to say what we don't know before we implement change. I think we need to know more. So one thing I'm interested in now in our group is understanding the experiences of women in applied ag research. What happens in the field? What does that experience look like? If we're talking about literally physically the field of going out into field trials and going out into communities. I think we don't know enough about what that looks like and feels like before we start making interventions. The other side is there's things we know, like fieldwork safety. I think that's something I've been trying to bring more to Cornell for our students. Thinking carefully about planning ahead. If you have a young woman student who's going out into the middle of the field on their own, or in the only women in a group of men that maybe they don't know well, that's not okay, right? So there's certain principles that I think can be applied for basic fieldwork safety. Even if nothing may happen, the feeling that that person has the whole time is not constructive. They're not going to be able to focus on their work because they may be having a feeling of threat. They may be having a feeling of insecurity that they can't talk about, right? So what does that mean for their performance? What does that mean for them to be able to be present as a scientist? So really, I think for women in ag research, going out to the field, I hypothesize, is probably one of the biggest barriers. We don't talk about it, we don't understand it very well, but I think I've heard enough anecdotally of even people telling me, oh, that person won't do well because their husband won't let them go out to the field, right? They can't go out to the field with other men. There's cultural norms that are really restrictive in different parts of the world that won't even get to that point of going out to the field, right? So it's self-selection at some point. I don't have the answer to that, I'm sorry, but I know it's probably a bigger problem than we ever talk about, my suspicion. Yeah.
Thank you. What about power relations and
Oof.
relationships? Are power relations gender specific, or does power per se and misuse in lines of power not care about gender?
Oh, I love these questions. Thank you. I wish I could see these people who are asking these. I think power is a word that's being used more recently in our fields, and I'm happy about that, but I'm worried it's being diluted because okay, let me take a step back. A lot of when we look at critically at systems, power imbalance and power underlies most of the problems, right? Who has power? How do they use it? How do they understand it? And how do they share it, right? Power is definitely part of the picture. In fact, a lot of feminist research, power is one of the first thing you look at. Who has power? Why do they have that power? And how do they use it? So power relations, in terms of even gender relations in a community, up to relations between a manager and the person they're managing, are power relationships. There's always power involved in all levels. How that power plays out, what form of power it takes, can be different, and how that's felt can be different as well. So I think that's a very big question, but I'm glad we're mentioning that word, because ultimately that's what it's about, right? Can you say something? Do you feel you have the power to speak? If you don't, you're not heard, because no one's ever going to listen to you. So, and realizing that that is a form of power, to be able to say something is something, again, we don't think about often enough, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. How can we foster sorority, collaboration in the scientific community, considering the prevalent competitive environment encouraged in early career stages?
Yeah. I think that depends on the institution. Right. I think it's how you structure an institution. Let me give an example. So I was once told, and I don't know how true this is, but different institutions hire differently. So coming back to faculty positions in the US, this may not be familiar to a lot of you, but let's give an example. Some institutions will hire 2 people before tenure, which means before they actually get the job, with the understanding of they'll compete against each other, right? And then at the end of the day, in 6 years' time, when one of them ultimately applies and is successful, that's a competition. And you know that other person is in competition with you. That is a toxic environment to live in, because you know constantly one of you is going to be out, one of you is going to be in. So I think it's up to the institutions we work in to very consciously not either hire 2 people who are in competition, or make sure there's resources, there's an allocation of resources that people feel they have opportunities, and they don't have to step on each other to get those opportunities. So that comes back to the first question, how do we get over the barriers in a way? That's one example. Create institutions where you don't have people feeling like they're competing against each other for limited resources. Either you can have different pots of money that are topically bound. You can have people talk to each other, but they're not put in a situation where it's okay, let the best person win, right? That doesn't work well. And unfortunately, that's a lot of how systems work. But I don't think there's not an absence of good examples of not doing that. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think that we are almost at the end. Would you like to share any final comments, any final advice that you would like us to follow?
Yeah. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And I guess my parting thought is, I don't think we're exceptional people who are catalysts of change, but really got lucky or did something right. But I really want to believe that everyone is at this level, right? That we shouldn't assume you have to be exceptional to become a leader, but it's in all of us, and you all have something really important to contribute. So don't let go, but also challenge the things that are holding you back, right? And that's hard to do, but there's a lot of us. There's enough of us to make change. So thank you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Dr. Brian Govers, Director General of CIMMYT and CIMMYT Community, we thank you so much. We thank you, and we thank Hale Tufan for sharing such valuable data and facts about the system that science women have to face. And thank you for sharing your own experience and sharing useful advices for women to become a good leader, a scientist, a mom, a person, to make the difference, right? So we thank all the audience for joining today and invite you to following the following seminar, Catalyst of Change, Women Leaders in Science. And let's do a recap of our catalysts we had this year, and stay tuned for more. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I believe this is a moment in human history for the removal of a landmine and the planting of a grapevine or tree of life is an act of peace. as a landmine is removed and that fruit tree is planted, it will feed future generations. By planting a tree also creates the carbon sequestration that will renew the lungs of the Mother Earth that we share.
When you come down to it, people aren't farmers because it's not like venture capital or something like that where you're just in it to make money. Like, they're there because they love it, because they love producing food. And so whether it's, you know, the corn that goes into making corn syrup or, you know, some heirloom tomato that you get at the farmer's market, it's love that's coming to you in food form.
To embrace and deliver on the words of World Food Prize founder Dr. Norman Borlaug, that food is the moral right of all who are born into this world.
As consumers really start to get an understanding of what goes into their food system and are really asking for and demanding a more sustainable food system, it might be the same hamburger, but it's going to come from cattle that are producing less methane and contributing less to climate change. It might be the same tortilla, but it's come from corn that is much more drought tolerant and farmers can grow it at a greater profit. And so many companies recognize this, that consumers really want a more sustainable food. And the companies have made commitments. They say, you want it, we're going to deliver it. And now the companies are trying to figure out how to deliver that.
Supporting women as catalysts of change involves highlighting diverse voices, experiences, and providing funding opportunities and mentorship, and fostering a culture of encouragement and self-acceptance for individual uniqueness and unconventional qualities. Together, we can empower women to drive positive change and create a more inclusive future for all. Thank you.
If in our own institutions and programs we continue to create barriers for women, how can we expect to remove barriers for women smallholder farmers? Dr. Borlaug's message to take it to the farmer was a wake-up call, but it's increasingly clear that to really fulfill his vision, we need to listen to unheard voices. Women do have voices. To hear them, we have to build bridges between crop improvement and social sciences, between the lab bench and the village bench. We also need to look inside ourselves, to question our assumptions, and to identify our internalized norms around gender, which we project onto our work and the populations we serve.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series.